What was the life of a Dalit like under a Chola king?
So,
did they practice untouchability?
yes, they did.
There's
inscriptional proof that Tamil society
and they took
had a
land
concept.
from Dalit. That's also like one of the...
They took land from a lot of people, including Dalits.
Okay.
But a whole bunch of different castes. But that is also the nature of power. But I'll come to that in a little bit. The first point I'd like to make about this is that the way that we remember the past is very multidimensional. We talked a little bit about how it has a clear political agenda in terms of making us feel pride, trying to get us to do a particular thing based on what we think about what happened 1,000 years ago. There's another aspect of it, which is to talk about the problems that Indian society faces as very much these exceptional things that have been foisted on us by such and such foreign power, and that are not integral problems that need to be talked about and addressed at a societal level. Inequality in the aftermath of British colonialism was talked about primarily as something that was a result of colonial rule. And while we didn't talk about ancient India as necessarily as a land of milk and honey, there was definitely a romanticism, this idea that, look, everything was kind of okay until the British came along.
Yeah.
The reality of it is that if you look at the Mughal tax records, and even like economic historians like Irfan Habib have talked about how the Mughal state was extremely exploitative. That is the nature of pre-modern polities. Now the extension of this has become that, you can't talk about India's economy today because the Mughals colonized us for how many ever centuries, and therefore we are still recovering from that, right? But I think that's where it'll end. No politician is going to go out and say that, look, inequality is a deep and recurring feature of pre-modern societies, not just Indian society, but all societies. These are societies that are designed to funnel wealth up to the top, and where the people at the top are taking big decisions about what to do with this money. Very often they're building temples, they're going to war. But by not talking about the inequality, you're able to romanticize this 1%, but more importantly, not deal with this long-running structural feature of Indian states, which is caste. And caste was very important to how medieval Indian states function, and has continued all the way up to the present.
Yeah.
But there's this, especially in urban India, because we think, and I think urban India is especially responsible for this way of thinking about it, because there's idea of urban India as being somehow casteless, as being somehow more equal, more full of opportunities, and therefore these are not problems that exist in urban India, and therefore these also could not have existed in the past, which was this land of plenty and so on. Now I've analyzed the way that we think about this. What the evidence tells us is something very different entirely. It is very obvious when you look at the inscriptions that only a very, very tiny section of society is literate. Okay, when you look at 10th century temples, the people who are giving the gifts to these small structures are shepherds, washer people, a whole bunch of diverse folks. In the 11th century, when the Chola state is growing, the gifts are given by royals.
Okay.
They're given by generals. They're given by administrators. In the 12th century, when inequality has kind of reduced a little bit, it's not the king who holds all the cards now, but a whole bunch of warlords. You see that society, the temple inscriptions become a little more representative, but not a lot. In fact, you increasingly see that because now the Chola aristocracy figures out tax evasion, they figure out how to buy land from peoples in distress, they develop the notion of private property, which is actually where we began this conversation. They figure out how private property works, and they figure out that gifting into temples means they don't have to pay tax on it. On the one hand, this is great for temples. Temples become these sprawling structures, awe-inspiring structures that we can still see today. They accept more and more kinds of people. But the downside is you have an increasingly large landless class that cannot take decisions about their land anymore, but rather depend on absentee landlords. And so from the 12th century onwards, you begin to see agrarian distress appearing in the inscriptions. You have a lot of cases where you have these super rich people who have been given land by the king or have just bought it over the decades, and villagers are not able to cultivate. They begin to flee their lands. The Chola state tries to auction off the lands, but nobody can afford it except the super rich once again. And so inequality grows worse and worse. And on top of this inequality, when political instability is introduced, so the Chola court falters, there's court politics, kings are replaced, outside armies begin to invade. This is devastating for the landless. And the inscriptions are very clear that people start selling themselves into slavery. Increasing from the late 12th century right into the 13th century, people are selling themselves, their families, extended families into slavery simply because they can't feed themselves. And so as much as we're talking about all these important developments in agriculture and so on, we also have to talk about the fact that these are coming because society is becoming unequal. And it's very important for us as citizens of a democracy, especially in the age of capitalism. While I will not go so far as to say that capitalism cannot contribute anything to a society, I will say that capitalism that is completely unfettered, that is able to do whatever it wants with no consequences, this untrammeled increasing of inequality to fund a particular kind of elite, inevitably has consequences for society at large. The innovations of an elite do not have to come at the cost of the misery of the majority. That is a story that Indian history tells us again and again.
And we see that with the Chola Empire.
We see that with all medieval empires. But very clearly with the Cholas, because you have this magnificent inscriptional record from this rich and complex and sometimes iniquitous society. And I think that these are the terms on which we need to understand medieval societies. To simplify them, to caricaturize them, to not allow them to be who they were, but to force them to be who we want them to be, it blinds us. It blinds us to the dynamics of power. It blinds us to how power has functioned and continues to function in India today. And it is very important for us as citizens of a democracy to be able to read power, to understand power.